Hello and welcome to North Harrow Community Library's series of virtual author talks. We'll be talking to a whole host of amazing authors and uploading those interviews right here to our YouTube channel. So please subscribe to us so that you never have to miss one of our videos. Today, we're incredibly lucky to be talking to Irenosen Okojie. Irenosen is the author of the Jalak Prize long-listed Nudibranch. This anthology was championed by Margaret Atwood as a wild recommended read and selected as one of the best books of the years in the Guardian and Observer review by Bernardine Evaristo and Diana Evans. Nudibranch also features the short story Grace Jones, which won the 2020 AKO Caine Prize for Fiction. She's also the author of the Betty Trask award-winning Butterfly Fish, and her work has been featured in the New York Times, the Observer, the Guardian, the BBC and Huffington Post, amongst other publications. She was featured in the Evening Standard magazine as one of London's exciting new authors, and she's a fellow of the Royal Society of Literature. Irenosen, thank you so much for talking to us.
Thank you for having me. I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
Absolutely. It's been so much fun reading your anthology, which I have here right now, but it will be in the library to borrow by the time this video comes out. So if you're watching, this is going to be in the library for you to borrow if you'd like so. And one thing that always strikes me when I'm reading your work is its lyrical and poetic quality, not just in its sounds and rhythms, but also in the density of images and meanings you create. Do you write poetry at all? Is that something you've considered doing?
Yeah, I love poetry. In fact, I write just like weird little prose poems every single day, about 9 or 10 of them a day, just because it keeps me anchored to the writing. And one of the things that I used to do when I first started writing was I would read poetry before I would start writing, and I just loved that because it opened up my brain, and it made me feel so excited about language and what the possibilities of language were. So I feel like that has really stood me in good stead, because you can see that influence in the work. You know, the writing is often quite lyrical, the image is quite poetic, and I'm always constantly trying to push the boundaries with language. You know, I would say that I'm an image maker, and poetry helped a lot with that. You know, listening to poetry. I also worked in the live poetry scene in London for about 5 years. So I worked for Apples and Snakes as their, coordinator. So I was always around live poetry and watching poets, and I was always around creative people doing interesting things with language. So poetry has been a big part of my education as a writer. I love it. I practice it every day because, even if I'm not working on larger projects, it means that I'm still creating these almost miniature pieces that make me feel really sort of tethered to the writing.
Do you know what, you saying that reading poetry kind of opened you up to the possibilities of language is how I felt reading your short stories.
Oh,
I felt like I was reading and I sort of saw the world in a slightly different way, in a way that I hadn't seen before because of the power of your imagery. So that's really interesting to hear. And talking about kind of imagery, all your short stories feature really powerful, stark or arresting images. And they all could mean so many different things. There's a wealth of meaning in your writing. When you write, are you more concerned about the images themselves and what they are going to look like in a reader's head, or are you more concerned about meaning?
That's a great question. I think I'm more concerned about what they look like to me, funny enough, because I'm so excited about creating, just very striking imagery and quite unique imagery as well. I've really sort of honed my skill at that. I'm always looking to create images that strike the reader in a different way, because I find that, they contain multitudes when you create images that are really unique, because not only are you imbuing it with your meaning as an author, you're leaving it open to the reader's perspective, and they can also kind of try to figure out, well, what does it mean? And very often the images, it's like falling down a wormhole. I think they contain multitudes, and that's what's fascinating for me when I create them, is that I always try to keep them slightly ambiguous, so you're getting a feeling from them perhaps, and also the image, but then you're also thinking, but I don't know, that could mean several possibilities, that particular image. And why does it strike me and make me feel happy, but why does it also make me feel slightly unsettled? So, it's kind of imbuing. An image can do so much and carry so much. So I'm always actively trying to be provocative, I think, with my imageries, and trying to disconcert the reader as well, somewhat, I feel.
That's good to hear, because I felt like when I was reading it, I had to set aside my usual understanding of language as being sort of one thing, and this idea of communication where you have to completely understand what's going on. And I tried to kind of embrace the ambiguity and play with it, I think a lot of the images are playful in that they don't necessarily say, this is what I am. And they let you kind of investigate and kind of get to grips with it on your own terms, which I think is really fascinating. And different, I think. It's been a while since I've had the ability to do that with a short story. That's really interesting. So another big thing that your book kind of talks about and is featured in your book is this idea of transformation. So a lot of your stories are about transformation, and your language echoes that theme as well. So in your short story, Kookaburra Sweet, you talk about a woman in translation, and that main character is transformed into a sweet licorice woman. And then in Philomel, you have monks who transform into animals. And even in your dedication, you've dedicated the book to those women whose reconfigurations in the dark become embers by dawn, which is such a powerful image and such a lovely image as well, I think. What drew you to write about transformations and reconfigurations? What about that theme makes it so potent to you, I guess?
Yeah, no, I think, so much has happened in my personal life, lots of like personal tragedies and traumas, and the idea of taking that and making something from that in the writing space is really it's quite a profound experience, and I find it really powerful because it's almost healing as well, and it feels like you transcend when you're doing that work, and I love the idea of that. So when I'm writing it, I'm not surprised that transformation is a theme that keeps coming up, because for me the writing space is transformative, but I also want the readers to get a sense of that. I don't just want to experience that as the writer. I want the work to reflect that and to represent that in a lot of the stories. So Kookaburra Sweet, except for example, you have this young woman who's come back from a failed trip to Sydney in Australia, where she thought she would basically just like start again, and it really didn't work out. It was pretty bad for her, so she's kind of had to come home with her tail between her legs almost. So the idea of her transitioning, becoming what she ate, came to me, and I thought, wouldn't that be such a potent image for the reader to sort of deal with? But also it works on multiple levels, because I'm also, not blatantly, but it's within the text, I'm also talking about Black women and the burden that Black women often have to carry in the world, how they can almost be sort of sacrificial lambs, so when you see her sort of reconfiguring within the text, that's also a part of of the meaning within that story. So it's working on several different levels, and I think transformation is so fascinating. How we come through things as human beings, and everybody has a different way of coping or adapting or adjusting. Everybody has a way of dealing with failure or loneliness or loss. So for me, like the psychology of all of that, the mapping of that is really fascinating. And all of that is connected to, how we sort of grow, how we, you're at a juncture or you're at some sort of crux in your life. How do you go to the next stage? How do you become a better person? How do you grow from that? Or maybe not, maybe you fall apart. And what does that look like? And that might be that's like a form of regression, I guess. So the two are really sort of fascinating to me, but I love the idea of transformation and what it can do and what it represents.
Yeah, I think readers get a real sense of transformation as potential for so many different things. I think when your characters change, it could be for so many different reasons, and it could be for so many different kind of reasons, I guess, overall. So yeah, really, really interesting. Your stories are quite surreal and magical, and I say this as the highest compliment, quite odd as well. But then they're also set in quite a familiar and knowable world, because you refer to places in London, you refer to real places, Forest Hill, the Horniman Museum, Barking Abbey, the Thames. Do you ever make a conscious decision to marry the odd and innovative with the mundane and tangible? Or is it more that there's something about a place that makes you want to include it in a story?
Good question. I think I make the decision to do that as part of the writing, because I love writing. I love marrying the surreal and the everyday. I think again it makes for that in-betweenness that's really an interesting space that actually contains several things. You can't quite define it, but you know it's interesting. You know it's a kind of interesting aesthetic. So, and all these places that you mentioned, of course, these are places I know and have spent time in and mean something to me. So, you know, the decision to incorporate them in these stories was very deliberate, but it's also in a way anchoring them, you know, anchoring them in reality, because of course my stories have other dimensions to them, but you know, it has to have some element of the real as well, so that people, you know, you can have a sense of place and you can have a sense of recognition, because that's also important, you know. So it's working on a simultaneous levels. It's, you know, this idea of the surreal, but also places that you recognize and places that you know, and the reader is also bringing their own sort of memories of maybe Forest Hill and the Horniman Museum, just if they see that line, you know, and that also conjures up things for them. So I love this idea of sort of anchoring space, but also it means that, you know, the readers are thinking about those same spaces and thinking about their own experiences and their own memories of it. And somehow that impacts perhaps the way they look at the story as well, or the meaning they draw from the story, or the meaning they draw from a scene. So that's all like quite fascinating to me, incorporating the two, like this idea of the fantastical. And I love the fantastical, but for it to sort of resonate as well, it can't all just be completely sort of far from removed from reality. You know, we have to have some things that anchor it for the reader, and I think place is is a very good way of doing that.
Mm-hmm. And I like this idea also. I mean, you were talking about how a reader's experience of a place can sort of add a different level to their reading of the story. But I do feel like now, if I go to Barking Abbey, I'm going to be imagining sort of time-traveling monks. I feel like your stories also like sort of transfigure the place themselves, because it adds like a layer of mythology and kind of, you know, another layer to these places that might seem ordinary, but have the potential to feature time-traveling monks or whatever it is, you know.
No, that's really cool. I mean, I walk past that abbey so often because I used to live in Barking, and I always had the idea for that story for a long time, but didn't quite get to grips to writing it for quite a while. And then when I did, it was like every time I walked past, I would see those monks that I had created in my head, you know, which is quite, you know, this idea of like art imitating life, or life imitating art, you know, very, very sort of closely connected. So that was a nice feeling in that case with that story.
I could definitely imagine. I feel like, you know, elevate the mundane, you know. Why have an abbey just be an abbey for you? You can also feature so many different things. Like, it just adds to life, I feel. And talking about place, you've moved a fair bit as a child. You know, you kind of went from Nigeria to Norfolk to East London to Lincolnshire, and you studied at a few different schools as well. What was that like for you growing up? And do you think this movement and exploration had any impact on you as a writer and your work?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, when I was growing up, it was difficult to keep moving from place to place, but I think all those experiences definitely enriched me as a writer and enriched my idea of identity, because I think, you know, identity is always sort of constantly, it's fixed, but it's also, interestingly enough, evolving, always slightly, I feel, always shifting a little bit. And depending on where I am, you know, I am a certain thing. So if I'm in Nigeria, they'll say, oh, British girl, you know, I'm not Nigerian enough to them. But when I'm here, I'm definitely other, you know, I'm Nigerian, I'm Black British, I'm also a Black woman. So all these identities carry different things and mean different things. And, you know, how do they all sort of coalesce? How do they all impact each other? So it was hard, but I also grew a lot from the experience. And the idea of identity, of course, was you know, a big theme in my debut novel, Butterfly Fish, this idea of inheritance and what that does, and, you know, how we carry it in the body is something that's really fascinates me. So writing about that, I found, was a way of claiming that inheritance. Also because I wrote about the Benin Kingdom, 18th century Benin. My family are actually from the Benin Kingdom, which the British looted all our artifacts, you know, and it's quite a painful history, but I was really proud to be able to sort of write about that history again. And because I was always fascinated by it. My dad would tell me stories. And when I first started writing the novel, for some reason, the idea of that kingdom just would not leave me alone. And it just became a magical thing to recreate it, because I hadn't seen it recreated in fiction. I'd seen it talked about in non-fiction, but not in fiction. So I really just had a ball recreating that world. And the kind of, I don't know, the kind of confidence it gave me was really, really special, I think. So identity is definitely important. Travel, moving from place to place, it was a hard thing, but I think all of these things have influenced the writing, and the way it manifests is always really fascinating to me, because I do write about it. You know, I do talk about those experiences, albeit through other characters, and maybe quite subtly. You know, writers often say, oh, you read a book and actually you see yourself in the book. You know, by the end of it, you see yourself and you recognize elements of yourself. So, you know, having had that, especially butterfly fish, I pick it up and I just go, whoa, that's definitely an experience that I had that sort of woven its way into the story. So I feel like it's all great fodder for the work. I feel like it's all important sort of learning for the writer, making sense of all of that, and also, you know, not giving ourselves a difficult time about that. You know, sometimes not quite fitting in, you know, was difficult in the past, but actually coming to terms with that and being okay with it. And, you know, human beings are endlessly complex, you know, and the things that I would have found difficult as a child, now I really embrace it, you know. For example, people used to have a real trouble with my name, and it always made me stand out so much as a kid. You know, joining an English boarding school, like I always knew when the teacher would come to my name on the register, because they would just pause and have that like look on their face, and it was always awkward. But now I love what my name means and what it represents, you know. So all these aspects of identity and travel, and what does a name mean and what does a name carry, you know, it's all interconnected, I feel.
Absolutely. You know, I really relate to that feeling of a teacher pausing when they're reading the register and you know exactly what they're trying to figure out. Yeah, yeah. I mean, you were talking about how some of the ideas came to you for Butterfly Fish. And I know the kind of where do you get your ideas from question is quite kind of hard and annoying to answer for a writer. But is there a story in the anthology that was inspired by something particularly interesting or odd or powerful for you?
Yeah, sure. I mean, as writers, we get ideas all the time. I was watching a news item, I think it was CNN a couple of years ago, and it was about the plight of albinos in Africa. And I was just stunned by what they have to go through. You know, they're persecuted, and just a simple act of like going to get water from the river could result in an albino being killed. And I found that really sort of horrific, but I was fascinated by, you know, their experiences. And I wanted to sort of shed light on that. I wanted to shed light on what it means to be an other within an other, and how people treat you, because I found that really, really interesting. So that sort of inspired my story. One of the stories in the collection about an albino man who goes back to Mozambique after the death of his mother to sort of build water fountains in the town, which becomes quite a hard experience for him, but it's also quite magical, and it's classically Irenosen. It's also quite dark as well. But I was really interested in that, the process of investigating, you know, the experiences of these people, and, you know, how they're often sort of, I guess, hunted because being an albino, it has this sort of mystical quality as well, but this danger to it. So to sort of being able to write about that, I felt like it was important to give them space on the page, because again, you know, when you're somebody who's sort of marginalized, people don't see your humanity or your full humanity. So I really wanted to sort of write that story in order to sort of reflect that.
That's fascinating. I didn't know the kind of background to that when I was reading the short story, but with that kind of extra level, yeah, no, that's really interesting. I like the idea that, you know, classically inspiration came from the muses, but you've got it from CNN. It's quite a nice kind of little
Yeah, I mean, that's
Yeah.
one of the more random ones where I got, but I mean, I get ideas from everywhere, but that particular story, yeah, that just came from, I just happened to be watching the news one evening, and that came up, and it just stayed with me, you know, it was a very short news item, I think maybe about 5-6 minutes, but I realized that I just kept thinking about it for days afterwards, and that to me is always a sign, you know, when you have an idea and it won't leave you. So I started to sort of plot creating the story, and then, you know, the story Mangata formed in my head. So that was how that came to pass.
That's very interesting. Talking about inspiration, I guess, what did you grow up reading? What would you pick out as sort of your literary foremothers or forefathers?
Yeah, I mean, I read voraciously. I read everything. The first book I read was Roald Dahl's Fantastic Mr. Fox. I loved that book so much. It's so funny. It's darkly comic, but it also felt like it was written not just for young people, but for adults as well. In its sort of dealing with certain themes. So I felt like Dahl was doing something really interesting, like straddling that YA and adult world with his books, and not just that one, but also Matilda. Oh my God, I love Matilda so much. It's like one of my favorite books, and just one of the best characters ever. So I loved that. I also read Toni Morrison quite a lot. I love Toni Morrison's books. The first book I read of hers was Jazz, and that blew my mind. Just what she was doing with language was incredible. You know, writing a book, you know, sort of about Black American life, and really honoring that unapologetically, but also mimicking a musical genre. You know, how do you do that? How does somebody do that? It just blew my mind that she did that. Yeah. So I really love her work. I also really love the stories of J. California Cooper, who's a Black American short story writer, not very well known in this country, but her stories are, you know, her stories about everyday life for Black American people, they're just beautiful. They're so understated, but so profound. Very different to my writing, completely different, but I love it. Her work always stayed with me. I also love Chinua Achebe, who wrote Things Fall Apart. So many writers, really. Buchi Emecheta as well, who's a Nigerian British writer that was based here in the UK. I love her sort of documenting of the immigrant experience, and, you know, women. It's just really feminist in the way she did that, you know, about women forging a path for themselves, and sort of really celebrating themselves, and really being determined in terms of what they wanted to achieve, but with all the ups and downs that happens in life as we know it. So yeah, I mean, these are some of the writers that I really like. One of the books I read that really stayed with me when I was a kid, actually, it's tremendous. It's called Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry, by Mildred D. Taylor. Oh my God, it's a phenomenal book. I remember that very well from my childhood. Like, I read that book and I couldn't put it down, and I was really emotional after reading it. So that's something from the archives that I would recommend. Also, Rosa Guy, a writer called Rosa Guy. I really loved her books as well, because I didn't really see much fiction reflecting Black people in the UK, young Black people. But Rosa Guy wrote, obviously she was a Black American writer, and she wrote about young Black Americans. So that was the closest that I could sort of connect with. But again, it was really sort of gritty. It was about urban life, but really beautiful done, and just characters that stayed with you. So yeah, I really liked her writing as well.
They all sound brilliant, and I think we have quite a few of them in the library. So if anyone is watching and anyone's inspired,
yeah,
come to the library.
I love it.
So one thing that I also read of yours was your creative non-fiction piece, Three Wise Women, which I absolutely loved. And I think that's going to be published in the anthology, What Doesn't Kill You. And I'm going to link the link in the information box below as well, so everyone can have a read of it. In that article, you write about how sometimes for a woman to reach for her true self underneath all the pain of brokenness, they have to try not to escape that pain, but to know it, sit with it, understand it, use it as fuel, then pass through it. Do you think you ever use writing as a way to sit with that pain, or does your writing serve a different purpose for you, or maybe multiple different purposes?
Yeah, I think it does all of that, multiple purposes. It definitely helps me, because the writing, I've always written. So whenever I'm going through a really difficult period, the fact that I have my writing as a space to come to means a lot to me. It means that even when I'm going through that difficulty, even if it feels like my body is breaking down or my spirit is struggling, there's something magical about the writing space. There's something transformative about going to that writing space at 6 a.m. in the morning with my peppermint tea, half asleep, half awake, scribbling away with my really bad doctor's handwriting, but making these worlds, you know. So that's the magic of it, I think, is to be able to create something even when you're going through these difficulties. So the writing, I think, you know, it works on multiple levels. It is a space, it is a transformative space, but also I think, yeah, being able to recognize when you're going through a difficult time and not to run away from that. That can be a hard thing to get used to, because it is quite painful, but to know that that's going to pass. You know, everything comes in cycles, I think. And I think if you can sit with it and you can grow and you can learn from it, whatever it is that you're going through, then that's all you can do, and you will be in a better space bit by bit by bit by bit. You know, you just have to be gentle with yourself, you know, when you're going through those difficult times. So that's what I always say. And, you know, also be nice to yourself, I think, is really important. You know, so sometimes when I'm writing, and I can write anywhere, mostly I write at home at my writing desk, but you know, if I want to treat myself, I might go to a museum and write, or, you know, go to a garden somewhere and write, or, you know, so you can sort of find a way to help yourself heal, and you can create a system of reward within the writing to do that, you know. And that's one of the things that I would do is, you know, I was often say to myself when I was working on Nudibranch, for example, I said, you know, when I finish this collection, I'm going to go on holiday. I'm going to go on holiday somewhere nice, you know. Like these kind of rewards, I think, just sort of help you get through things. So yeah, I think thinking specifically about the things that make you happy, or the things that you can sort of reach for the carrots you can reach for while you're going through things, it just makes a world of difference, you know. So yeah.
It's nice to know that the writing can be a carrot and not just a stick to kind of feel down about. Yeah.
It's important. I mean, I have such a, no doubt writing can be hard, you know, it's not an easy thing to do, but I have such a joy of writing. And there's something, you know, there's something really unbelievable about creating a whole world and having people being immersed in it. It's a high unlike any other. And when it's working, when you're just a vessel for these characters who are talking in your head, and you're going to the supermarket and they're speaking to you and, you know, they're telling you things and the plot is moving along, there's something really powerful about that, you know. So, and I think that shows in my writing. I think you can see the love of the craft on the page, because of course if writing was laborious for me, I think it would show on the page as well, which is why I write in a, you know, I tend to write for short bursts. So I'll write really early in the morning, 6 a.m. or 7 a.m. and I'll write for maybe 2.5 hours to 3 hours, and I do that maybe 4 times a week. So the writing is building incrementally, but I'm doing it in short bursts, so it keeps the excitement there. It keeps me excited to coming back to the page, and things are bubbling away in between. I'm not trying to write for 8-hour stints in one day, or, you know, everybody has a different way of doing it. I'm not saying that that's wrong. As writers, you have to figure out what works for you and what's your, you know, your best sort of space to write. But for me, writing in that way, writing in short, exciting bursts, means that on the page, the writing is exciting for the reader and for me to write.
Yeah. Do you think you figured out your process quite early on? Did you go into your first novel knowing that this was the best way for you to write, or was it a bit of trial and error of you kind of figuring out what the best place the best way to write is for you?
Yeah, no, it was trial and error initially. I think it is for most people. You sort of do different things and you see what works. And, you know, I tried writing for like 5 hours, 4 hours, and I just felt exhausted. I felt like, God, this is like, you know, working on a dissertation or something. Like, you know, I need to break it up. And also writing the novel, you know, it was quite an intimidating process. So what I did was, after writing a first draft, I sort of put it down and started writing short stories, which is where my collection Speak Gargantua came from, because I wanted to keep writing, but I didn't want to be in the novel world because I just needed a break from it. So I then discovered short stories, having picked up a collection of short stories I'd had for 7 years but had never read, hilariously. But this collection blew my mind. It's called Jegatheesan by Dennis Johnson, an American writer. And it was about a drug addict sort of on the fringes. You know, this character nobody would normally care about. And they were interconnected short stories just about his world and his travels and the different characters that would move through his world. And it was so wonderfully done. There was like no judgment. It was funny, it was surreal. It had this element of social realism, and the writing was phenomenal. Still probably, I would say, the best short story collection I've ever read, and I've read quite a few. That's still my favorite one out of all of them. And also elements of the surreal in it as well, in a really profound, funny way. So I read that collection and I couldn't believe that you could do that with short stories. I thought, wow, short fiction can make people feel this invested. So I thought, I want to try this. So I started writing stories myself. And I found that actually, when I went back to the novel space, I was a much more confident writer. And what I did was I psychologically tricked myself, working on the novel, you know, just sort of thinking those chapters were like interconnected short stories rather than a novel, because I felt less intimidated.
That's very clever.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
you just figure a way around these things, you know.
Yeah.
But the point is that you find a way that it's not laborious, you know, that it's not a chore. You have to find, that's why this whole idea for me of like writing, but also rewarding yourself, because of course the writing is a lonely process as well. You know, you're alone, you're doing it alone. So I always say, you know, go out, go to the museum, go and have dinner with friends, or, you know, just feel connected to the real world somehow, so you're not completely just sort of isolated or withdrawn while creating these worlds. You know, you have to strike a balance, I think.
Mm-hmm. Were you writing at all during lockdown? Because talking about, you know, how writing is lonely and the need to kind of come together afterwards, I'm sure it was very difficult in lockdown. So was that something that you felt like affected your writing, or did you manage to kind of power through it?
Yeah, no, lockdown writing, the writing space in lockdown has been complicated, as I expected. So I did write a short story actually, early on, which I'm still surprised by, but that's because the deadline was looming and the editor was like, can you just hurry up and like do this story? So I was like, yeah, okay, I'll get on with it. So I was really pleased to get that story written. But then also I found it difficult to concentrate after that because so much was going on. I mean, just everything. The world has really turned on its head. We're living in a dystopia at the moment, as something that's out of a movie, and it's just really hard to process all of that and to think about writing in the same way, you know. So I had real difficulty after my wonderful burst of writing that short story. Then it was just like I would go to my writing desk and I would just sit and just be thinking, and found that I wouldn't be able to concentrate. So, I mean, I still write my poetry every day, which is good. I think I do that on autopilot, which is a good thing, because if that wasn't happening, I'd be really worried. But then I thought to myself, it's okay, actually. It's okay to not have to produce loads of work during this period, you know, like stuff can just be ticking away, and then I'm sure in time that something will come from it, you know. So I'm not judging myself as harshly as I was in the beginning, because I was just like, I felt like you need to be producing more, you need to be just, but actually look at the times we're in. It's so tricky to get your head around everything. It's a massive adjustment. So I think, you know, artists, in whatever way they're responding, whether they're responding immediately and wholeheartedly, great. But also if you're not doing that, or if it's been a mix, that's also okay.
Yeah, I think there definitely is a misconception that unless you have words on a page, you haven't been productive. But I don't think that's really how writing or the thinking behind writing works. Sometimes you're kind of doing the work when you're doing something completely different, when you're shopping or just sitting there.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think you're always sort of writing in a way, because even when you're not physically doing it, you know, you're spinning ideas in your head, you're thinking about plot, you're solving a plot issue, you're thinking about dialogue that one of your characters has said while you're doing the laundry, or just quickly going to the shop, or getting, I don't know, ice cream from the ice cream van. It's always sort of just bubbling away, isn't it? So
Yeah.
the actual physical act, I feel, of doing the writing, like that's something that comes at the end of that. But you know, and most people see that, recognize that as the writing, but actually the writing happens away from that too, you know. So I think when you look at it that way, I think you feel less anxious about it. You know, it can help in feeling less anxious about it.
Yeah, there was a great cartoon that I saw where it was talking about just kind of producing creatively, and how producing something that's sort of tangible is you breathing out, but then you also need the inspiration, the breathing in, to be able to breathe out. And I felt like that really helped with kind of the anxiety of productivity, of trying to produce something for, you know, all the time continuously, without taking a moment to take a breath in and to actually sit with something and to bring up the gem that's going to actually produce the tree, if that makes sense.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
That's absolutely amazing, and so true. You know, we have to feed ourselves as well. This is why figuring out what inspires you aside from the writing space is really important, I think. So for me, I love to go to museums and see like exhibitions by, you know, like experimental women artists, because often the imagery is so good, so striking, that I can go and see, you know, somebody's exhibition and just be fed like amazing imagery, and it would just percolate in my head, and I would just want to produce context for those different images. And the process of distillation that happens is really quite fascinating, you know, from being in a space like that. Similarly, like film, I get a lot from, I love film. I used to write for a filmmakers magazine years ago, you know, just going to screenings and writing about different films. I love the medium because, again, it's this idea of story, but condensing it within like a 2 hour, you know, or 2.5 hour, 3 hour frame for an audience. And, you know, what are the mechanisms of telling a story? You know, how do you do it in a way? It's a bit like telling a short story, I think, you know, films. So, you know, there are parallels that you can sort of draw from that. So film, theatre, museums, just stuff that like really feeds you and gets you excited about wanting to do the work really is really helpful, I think.
Yeah. In your article, you write really beautifully and powerfully about the kind of writing life and its sort of pleasures, but also its kind of pain. What do you kind of wish new writers or even non-writers understood about the writing life?
I think I would like them to just give themselves time to find their voice, I think, because in the beginning, you are so keen to be an amazing writer and you want it yesterday. I know I felt like that. And actually, it took years for me to be the writer that I am now. And I'm really glad that I went through that process, because now I think I have a really distinctive voice as a writer, you know, and a really sort of distinctive aesthetic. And that didn't come overnight. That was a process of like writing and rewriting, and like, what kind of stories do I want to tell? What sort of ideas do I have? What does that say about what I'm trying to do with the work? So, you know, keep investigating, keep feeding yourself as much as possible, and also absolutely have the confidence to claim that space. You know, there is a space for your voice, especially if you're a person of color. I would say that don't listen to anybody that tries to make you feel like there isn't space for you, or the stories that you want to tell aren't important, because sometimes that happens along the way and it can be really disheartening. Unfortunately, we know what that's like, where people don't want you to be in the space for whatever reason, but that's not about you, that's about them. You know, you just absolutely do the work, love the craft, and connect with people who can be good enablers to help you move through the process. And by that, I mean, you know, connect with a writing development agency so you can have access to stuff, so you can have access to mentors, to events, to workshops. One of the things that was really helpful for me early on was I connected with Spread the Word, a writing development agency in London, and they were running a mentorship scheme, and I applied for that with what was, you know, it was initially a short story at the time, but then later became my novel, Butterfly Fish. And the amazing thing about that is they paired me up with a writer called Donna Daly Clark, whose book I had been reading that summer and I loved so much. And then I found out not only did I get in, but that she was my mentor, and I felt like this is serendipity here. And that just, it just gave me so much access. They just create this platform where you feel like things are possible. So I would really encourage like emerging young writers to do that, you know, find those spaces that want to champion young voices and help you develop. And through that sort of plug-in, you know, you can grow, you can access things that will really help you along the way on that journey. And then just keep learning. Like, you know, the process of writing, I see it as an investigation. You know, never think you know everything. Be hungry, but also have a certain humility as well, I think.
Mm-hmm. Sort of linked to that, in that article, Three Wise Women, you write about your time in Berlin, and you talk about a particularly stiff door. You write that the door seemed metaphorical to me, reflective of how, as a Black woman in the UK, I had to lean into spaces and put my full body weight into opportunities in order to break them open for myself. I thought this was such a sort of perceptive metaphor, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that, a little bit more about your experiences.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I guess that just represents the fact that, you know, once you're even let into a space, if you are let in, you really have to fight hard. You know, you really have to prove that you belong in that space. And I found that a lot, especially when I was working through the arts. You know, I remember once going to a marketing sort of gathering, and one or two people implied that was I there on some sort of scheme. And actually, no, I'd really worked hard. I'd really worked hard and earned the job. And it was just this perception sometimes that people had about you that I found, you know, really, really difficult. You know, you had to be excellent. You had to be better than just good. You know, you couldn't afford to sort of rest on your laurels, because then you wouldn't really be allowed in or fully get the benefits of that opportunity. So that's what I meant by really having to lean into those spaces, you know, really sort of making the most out of it. And very often, of course, unfortunately, you know, there's usually very few of us in those spaces. So you almost feel like you have an extra sort of thing to prove, because you don't have somebody else who looks like you there. And you know, you are held to a different standard. The gaze on you is so intense very often, you know, and it's a pressure. It really is. So, I mean, that's what I meant. I mean, that metaphor encompasses so much, but these are the things that I'm talking about, and that as people of color, we completely understand what, you know, what that means and what that feels like when you're sort of allowed into a space. It also means that you have to do well, because you're thinking about the people coming behind you. You know, if I mess this opportunity up, you know, they're not going to hire somebody else that looks like me, or it's not going to happen for a long time, you know. So these are the nuances, I think, of being in particular spaces. And of course, we know that this is, you know, in whatever industry, this is like a thing that's like concurrent and runs through whatever sort of industry you're a part of as a person of color. You know, you have to be sort of aware of it. So and of course, the arts space, as liberal as people proclaim to be, is also guilty of this. You know, it also happens in the arts scene, unfortunately. So that's why it's important, I think, to find your champions and to find people who can really like see something in you. I remember when I was, you know, when I first started working in the arts, there was a really lovely woman who was sort of the director at Apples and Snakes where I worked, and she saw something in me, and she really made an effort to sort of spend time with me and encourage me, and, you know, give me projects that she thought I could learn from and sort of take ownership of. And that gave me a certain confidence that she saw that. And I wonder now, looking back, if, you know, she's a white woman, but she came from a working class background and kind of worked her way up. So she had this sort of openness, I guess, a kind of understanding, not a complete understanding, obviously, but a sort of willingness to, you know, to sort of be supportive and find a way to support me quietly behind the scenes. So, you know, and then later on, I had a Black mentor who was completely incredible. So yeah, you kind of have to sort of find your way, but you have to find your champions as well. I think that helps. So that's a really long answer to your question, but hopefully I answered it.
No, I'm just so enthralled. You can probably see in my face that I'm just sort of hypnotized by what you're saying. But you know, what you were saying about that kind of pressure and that anxiety, I think it's sort of doubly destructive, because when you're in the creative fields, being anxious and feeling pressure isn't massively conducive to producing your best work. So having the kind of weight of that on your shoulder almost feels like a never-ending cycle. So
Yeah,
it's so hard to prove yourself when you know you have to, and it's sort of hard and anxiety inducing.
Oh my goodness, absolutely. And that's why it's important to have somebody that you can talk to about these things. I think just being able to, like, you know, I had a mentor who was also a coach, and in our sessions, I would talk about all the stuff that was driving me nuts. And that just was it was such a relief to get that pressure, to have a safe space to talk about these things, you know. So I think having safe spaces, or finding safe spaces where, you know, we can have those conversations, really help as well.
Absolutely. So last final question, and it's a question we ask everyone because we're incredibly biased. Why do you think libraries are important?
Libraries are incredible, amazing spaces. The first time I discovered a book, that Roald Dahl book that I mentioned, it was in the school library, and I just sat there completely enthralled, and I have not stopped being enthralled by library spaces since. I would credit library spaces as the reason why I'm a writer, because I picked up my first book in a library, and it was such a profound, transportive, transformative, magical experience, that even when I moved away from where I was going to boarding school, when I moved to London, I was in the library every day. You know, I was that kid with the library cards, you know, those annoying kids where they would take out 8 or 10 books. I was one of those ones, and you know, the librarians knew me, like they knew me by name, because I was just, I practically lived there. So I think that they're just wonderful spaces because they show you the power of words, the power of the imagination, and the power to imagine beyond the world that you know. I think is one of the greatest gifts you can ever discover. It's like having a key, you know, and if you're lucky and smart enough to discover that key when you're young, it's amazing. It's an amazing, amazing feeling. I always felt like the friends I had who didn't read, I felt like they were really missing out on something, you know, whereas I had access to these worlds, and it made me feel like the world was a different space. For me, the way I experienced the world, the way I saw the world was different because of libraries and because of books. And of course, libraries provided that for me. So I just, they're invaluable as far as I'm concerned. I love them.
Yeah, we basically think the same as well.
I agree.
Yeah. I was that little annoying kid
who
wanted to take out more books than actually was allowed on the card.
Exactly.
And now working at the library, I get to see the next generation of kids come up who are also doing the exact same thing.
Amazing.
Them. Yeah,
you must love your job so much. Like, it's wonderful.
It's so great. It's so great. It's great to be a volunteer at this library. It really is. Irenosen, this has been so illuminating and so wonderful and so joyous. And I think perhaps the best way to end the interview would be to have some more of your words. So if you could read something for us from one of your short stories, I think, give library members a taste of what they can expect if they come to borrow.
Absolutely. So I'm going to read from my AKO prize-winning story, Grace Jones. This is an excerpt. There was a building that remained a husk, a blackened charcoal carcass gutted from the inside out. The carcass leaned against the heavens in protest at its losses, at its snatched internal sky, tainted with the fingerprints of one last daily procession, rituals of the living. And while the world slept, awoke, the cities hummed with chaos and order, rivers began in cotton pockets, cupping slackened fists, The waters undulated into lost reflections. The gods got high off the colors from the seas. The equator adjusted itself only slightly. The stars twinkled in haphazard collusion. The mountains dappled by hurricane winds that became personal directions. The building remains. An artificial guts bathed in degrees of light, lodged in the stages of a day. The building was a hollow within a carcass, within a husk, within a world, within a galaxy. A series of crooked boxes varying in size, inside each other, where the gift was always the same, always attached to a bottom that had gone missing. On each floor of the husk, Sidra was running backwards to the late afternoon of a day. It had been flat packed into cardboard boxes sealed with sellotape. On each floor, Sidra peeled off the sellotape, the sound a split in the air whose line couldn't be traced. She removed items from the box. The late afternoon that day was made up of ingredients for cake: eggs, flour, butter, sugar, tinfoil, a whisk, vanilla. On each floor, Sidra ran to the window where she stood in costumes made of tinfoil. On floor 1, she was covered with eggs, screaming. On floor 2, she was drenched in flour, howling. On floor 3, she was soaked in butter, melting as a heat intensified while the whisk whirred ominously on the periphery. And so on. Grace Jones's La Vie en Rose played on a radio that wasn't plugged in anywhere. Instead, the plug sprang from the bottom of the building like an untethered electrical root. The husk shook. On each floor, Sidra grabbed the whisk. Lost scenes fell out from the windows. Water was inadequate. Hoses throbbed with adrenaline and burned hearts. Death traps. The lifts became stuck all over again, spewing firemen's costumes like overgrown fabricated insects, like Genesis on speed. Everything escalated quickly. Ashes assembled into figures crawling on the skyline before colliding with traffic, which destroyed them all over again. The equator turned a fraction. The flames rose. The bottoms of the crooked boxes were set alight. Debris became glowing cinders that walked. A dot appeared on the galaxy. The draftsman held a flame he angled like a stick of lead, like a tool that could change guise at any point. I'll leave it there.
That was brilliant. Thank you so much. You can borrow Irenosen's book from our library, or you can buy it from wherever you buy your books. Thank you again, Irenosen. This has been a brilliant, brilliant afternoon for me. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for having me, Ramya. It was lovely to talk to you. Hope to speak to you guys again at some point.
Definitely. When we can welcome you into our library safely, you'll be the first person on that guest list.
Oh, that would be lovely. Thank you.
Thank you so much for watching this video. You can find all the details about the author and their work down in the description box below. If you enjoyed this video, please like, share and subscribe. We're a small independent community library, and so we need your help to keep us going. If you'd like to support us, we have a PayPal link in the box below. We also have lots more videos available on our channel for children and adults alike, so please do check those out. North Harrow Community Library wouldn't be able to survive without your generous support, so thank you. If you'd like to find out more about our library, please use the links in the box below. See you soon.